Thanks very much, and I'm delighted to be here to speak to you all about ethics in randomised trials this morning. So as Tom said, I'm a programme officer at the National Office for Research Ethics Committees, and I'm going to speak to you today just to give an overview of ethics in research, an introduction to the National Office, which is a relatively new part of the research network in Ireland, an overview of our NREC system, and I'm going to go through some sort of typical NREC considerations and the scope of review that we see from our committees. And at the end, I'm just going to touch on the EU clinical trial regulation, which has recently come into force after a year-long transition period. So I think this quote sums up really well the ethics of clinical trials and research, and I suppose life in general. It really highlights, in terms of clinical trials and research with participants, that the participant is at the heart of everything. That the ethics of clinical trials is underpinned by the considerations for the participant at the heart of it. So just to give you a quick overview of the fundamental ethical principles rooted in the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki and translated into good clinical practice. These include the respect for autonomy and self-determination, beneficence, non-malfeasance and justice. And all of these really cover all parts of clinical trials ethics, and again with the participants at the heart. So, in terms of informed consent, which is sort of the underpinning of all clinical trial ethics, if a participant is not aware of the full risks or benefits of the trial, they cannot be fully informed, and therefore they cannot give informed consent. A trial that is not well designed scientifically cannot be ethical. It contributes to research waste. As Karen spoke about yesterday, not choosing the correct outcomes at the outset of your trial leads to research waste, but it also leads to the wasting of time of the participants and their samples and their participation in the trial, and that can't be ethical in terms in addition to not being scientifically rigorous. Clinical trials aim to, of course, address an unmet clinical need at their very basics. To provide social good for participants, to improve a standard of care, but these have to be scientifically rigorous and based on rigorous preclinical work. Anyone who runs clinical trials knows about the rigorous safety reporting involved and the oversight of independent data monitoring committees, and that ties in with the non-malfeasance that the research would be stopped if participants were at risk of harm. And finally, justice, and that's inclusion of all participants of all diversities, ethnicities, genders, ages, etc. Clinical trials that maybe recruit only a certain diversity of participants, the outcomes can't be generalised to other demographics or cohorts of participants, and therefore it's really important to be inclusive in clinical trials. So what is a research ethics committee? So a research ethics committee in general, and including our national research ethics committees, diversity of individuals, and diversity is really important. They bring a wealth of backgrounds, experience, expertise from a variety of background to come to a consensus on clinical trial applications. And this would include patient-public involvement, of which we also have PPI members on all of our committees who bring a wealth of experience. They play a key role in protecting the participants, and again, this comes back to the participant and their well-being. Research ethics committees are found everywhere, and in Ireland we operate under a mixed model system whereby the NRECs have a very specific remit of medical devices, clinical trials of investigational medicinal products. Recently, the COVID-19 Biobank REC has also been established. They have regular CORIT committee meetings, and we are no different, our committees are no different, and they review the ethics underpinning the research proposals, and that is from the design of the trial to the participant information leaflet, and I'll speak a bit more about that as we go on. And then they can decide to give an approval or a request for information, or to give an unfavourable. Okay, so the National Office for Research Ethics Committee, so we are an independent office with a statutory role. So we are relatively new, established in 2020 through the NREC bill. We host and facilitate the work of our National Research Ethics Committees. Our mission is to embed a robust, transparent and cohesive research ethics review system and to strengthen the national research infrastructure. So NRECs have been assembled in prescribed areas of health research by the head of the National Office and appointed by the Minister for Health. And to date, we have 2 clinical trial committees, 1 medical devices committee. We had established an NREC COVID-19 committee at the outset of the pandemic to enable rapid ethics review for COVID-19 trials. And that was a really good sort of proof of concept for the office. That committee still sits as a subcommittee to review amendments to those studies. And as I said, the NICB REC has recently been established in the past couple of months. So the NRECs provide a single national ethics opinion by consensus on full applications and then substantial modifications to those applications. So just an overview of the vision and mission of the National Office, and as our primary remit, we facilitate and host the committees in the work that they do, but we also liaise with a number of stakeholders across Ireland, including the Department of Health, the HPRA, local recs, and researchers across the country. In my capacity as Programme Officer, I also liaise with a number of EU working groups that I sit on, and that sort of involves a lot of collaboration across all member states. To engage with the research ethics community and the general public in general, and to be essentially an agile and trusted office in national public service. So the NREC-CT, which is the committees that I work with primarily, so the scope of the committees is clinical trials of investigational medicinal products, and there's decision trees available online from ourselves and the HPRA to determine if your trial falls under our remit. So there are 28 members for each committee, and who have expertise across all areas, medical, health, science, law, social sciences, ethics. We also are lay members. We also have our PPI members. So very diverse grouping of people who give so generously of their time and expertise, and we really appreciate all the work that they do. There are 2 main meetings per month, 1 for each committee, and 2 subcommittees per month to review substantial modifications to trials. Reporting to the Minister for Health, and we support the committees operationally. And the remit is new clinical trial applications, which as of the end of January must come through the EU system, CETIS, Clinical Trials Information Systems, and substantial modifications which can continue to be submitted to studies under the Clinical Trial Directive, which is the previous legislation, for another year and a half approximately. So the remit of the NREC-CT, as I've mentioned, is investigational medicinal products. So the types of trials that we see now, no trial is going to fulfill all of these criteria, but just to give you some of the options of the combinations of trials that we would see: randomised, double-blind, placebo-controlled, open-label, parallel group, mononational, multinational, multi-centre trials. We review full applications and, as I said, substantial modifications with a decision made by consensus. So I referenced the mixed model system before. So, and we've only been operational with the NREC-CT since mid-2021. So obviously there was a lot of trials that had been approved and overseen by the local recognised recs. So they were able to transition to the NREC through submission of a substantial amendment, or modification as they're now called, under CTR. So they would have transitioned to us over the past couple of years, but all new trial submissions that come to NREC will now come through the European portal as of the end of January. So just to give you an overview of the review system, so they're submitted to the National Office. through CETUS or through our application process under CTD. They're always electronic, we don't accept paper, and the office, we validate the applications. They then get sent to the committee for review for each agenda, who can access it using a secure online reading room. There'll be review leads and secondaries, but of course all decisions are made by consensus then. So at the NREC meeting, they're all virtual. Once quorum is established and a consensus is made on each application, and then the decision is forthcoming. Which may be a request for further information, in which case we will go back to the sponsor to ask them everything that the committee has asked for. We would then feed back the applicant response to the reviewers, and a final decision would be made. And through CETUS, this all happens on that system, which is essentially where I live on a day-to-day basis. So if anyone has any questions on CETUS, just don't hesitate to ask. So the ethical principles instilled by the NRECs. So it's of value. So does this trial enhance health or knowledge? And this all comes back to scientific designs, the rigorousness of the design, the rigorousness of the data that leads to this research question. As I said, if it's not scientifically rigorous, it's not going to be ethical to conduct. The methodology must be rigorous, and in terms of the cohort of participants that will be enrolled, must be fair, and it comes back to this idea of justice, beneficence, and non-malfeasance. Informed consent is the underpinning of all of our ethics reviews, and this includes looking at the patient information leaflets, and Lydia spoke really well about that yesterday, so I won't have to say quite as much after her talk. But the informed consent process, and I'll talk a bit about that shortly as well. And again, the respect, dignity and well-being, and just to finally mention an independent review with no conflicts or affiliations. If there is a conflict of interest within the committee, they won't be present, that member wouldn't be present for any of those deliberations, and that would be minuted. And if anyone is interested in looking at our minutes, they are all published on our website. So what sort of NREC considerations might we see? So the key thing here is the accessible language, and Lydia spoke a lot about this yesterday. If a participant does not understand what they're consenting to, then it's not informed consent. The language has to be accessible and has to be of a certain reading age to ensure that all participants will be able to understand it. And again, coming back to the idea of looking at the outcomes, how those outcomes are measured, the research question, the statistical plan, the looking at the PI and the site and their facilities, looking at the risk-benefit ratio, and all of these things are reviewed by our committees. And of course, the recruitment of participants, how will they be recruited? Will there be advertisement material used? How will that be used? What does it look like? Who will be doing the informed consent? How much time will a participant have to decide? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and especially an unjustified exclusion of a vulnerable group? So if a group is excluded, there must be a justification, and even then further information could be sought on this. And again, the care and protection of the participants. So, do they have adequate insurance and indemnity? What are the compensation parameters for participants? All of these things are looked at by the committees. And again, the confidentiality, very important, GDPR, and of course we have our health research regulations here in Ireland as well. So future biological research, what's going to happen to the data? Where is the data going? Where are the samples going? How long will they be kept? How secure are the online tools used? And we look for input from a DPO on the DPIA to give that sort of security to the sort of reassurance to the committee that the DPIA and all arrangements for under GDPR are upheld. So again, the informed consent process, so valuable and so important, and really the sort of the hallmark of all clinical trials ethics. So how comprehensive and understandable is the written information? and the oral information. The who is going to be consenting participants, what are the arrangements for vulnerable populations, and is it aligned with GDPR, and the role of an impartial witness. Nobody can consent on behalf of another person, but if a participant maybe does not have the capacity to sign a document, that the impartial witness would be present at the informed consent process and essentially sign to ensure that the participant has consented for themselves. So they would not consent on behalf, they would simply sign to say that participant has consented. So community considerations, and again, the impact on local community, availability of the IMP after the trial. Is there any arrangements for that from the sponsor? And how are they planning on disseminating the outcomes? And again, that must be transparent and accessible. So valid consent is the mandatory safeguard of all clinical trials. And what is informed consent? So informed, first of all. So the participant must know what they are consenting to. What are the risks? What are the benefits? What side effects might they expect? All of these things are really, really important. And it should be specific. So it can't just say, please give me consent to do whatever I want with your samples. That's not informed consent. It must be unbundled. So you need to be able to initial each individual section, each individual statement on the informed consent form, rather than a big list of stuff, and then you just give a signature at the end. It must be freely given, of course. Easy to withdraw, so all participants have the right to withdraw without giving any reason at any point in the trial, and it must be recorded. So whether that's a signature or if it's oral consent, that would also be recorded. So it must be specific, explicit, as informed, and broad consent for, say, future biological research is valid. If a sponsor says, we want to use your samples for future biological research in this specific disease area. But the sponsor at this point, it's future research, so they might not actually know exactly what they're looking for at that point. But it is valid consent if there are safeguards to apply to that. So if a participant is told, we don't know what we want to do with your samples in this disease area yet, but we will add a consent to your ICF to ask you if we can contact you again when we do know, so that person would then have an option to then consent at a later date. Or a sponsor might include a clause where they will apply for further ethical approval before they carry out the next study. So these are examples of safeguards and the broader the consent, the more safeguards we would expect to see. Blanket consent is never permissible, and it never was permissible. So in terms of specific activities, it can only be valid when it was, as I've just said. So what about participants who may lack capacity to consent, participants who might be in an emergency situation, who might not be conscious, essentially. So I'll talk about that briefly in a sec. So in terms of consent for data processing, so only the person themselves can provide consent for the processing of their data. So if this explicit consent cannot be obtained, anonymized data may be processed only, or the researcher can go to the HRCDC, which is a secretariat also hosted by the HRB like ourselves, and that committee can give a consent declaration if based on the application, where they were satisfied that the public's interest in carrying out the research significantly outweighs the requirement for explicit consent for these individuals. Okay, so capacity. So what if a participant does not have the capacity to consent on their own behalf? And this could be fluctuating capacity, intellectual disability, participants in emergency situations, minors. So the NREC would look for the following in an application. So what is the approach to capacity in these senses? And in terms of the CTR legislation, there are articles that pertain exactly to these scenarios. So an NREC might ask the sponsor to outline the ways in which all of these parts of these articles are going to be fulfilled in line with the legislation. So how is capacity determined? And again, the NRECs would want to know how a researcher is going to determine capacity. It should include all the relevant consent and assent forms. So consent, obviously we know consent. Assent is a person agreeing to take part. So maybe a minor might assent to say that I agree to take part, but they cannot legally consent. The parents would consent, parents or guardians would consent on their behalf. But an assent form would indicate their agreement. So again, safeguards, how do we use witnesses in this sense? And then, of course, how does this tie in with our relevant EU national regulations and policies such as the HSE National Consent Policy, an update of which was published very recently and is extremely comprehensive and useful document. So vulnerable participants, the NRECs value and encourage inclusion of all individuals representative of society. This comes back to the idea of justice that may benefit in the conduct of studies. So what is the justification for inclusion or exclusion? So maybe breastfeeding, pregnant participants, capacity. It must be compliant with relevant regulations. What are the safeguards in place? What are the implications for consent? And again, how is that consent going to be approached? To look at all of the additional documentation, and these may include assent forms and inclusion of minority groups. So, these and maybe provision for translator for a participant who may not have English as their first language, or translation of patient information leaflets, and all of these sort of things. So this is all items that the NREC would be looking for in the application. And again, this is just a link to the HSE National Consent Policy for Health and Social Care Research, and I've mentioned that. So data protection, compliance is also hugely important because it needs to be in line with GDPR and our health research regulations. And the NRECs need to be assured that participants' data is safeguarded. What happens if it's going to move out to the EU? There's lots of sponsors who are based in the States and elsewhere. So what happens when the data goes there? How is it going to be protected? The risk assessment, the DPIA, with input from the DPO to assure the committee that, it is upheld. And I suppose just to complete this section, common clarifications required by the NRECs would include, but certainly not limited to, the transparency around personal data to third countries and or other organisations, delegated organisations as part of the clinical trial from the sponsor. What point in the study is the data pseudonymised, or at what point is it already anonymised? The reference to GDPR and the HRR in participant materials, so that communication, whether it be a shorter version or a more comprehensive version, and such that the participants really understand what is happening to their data, how is it protected. How participants can withdraw from the study, that's really important. All participants have the right to withdraw no matter what, and they have the right to give no reason whatsoever. So that's just letting the participants know that. The separation of consent for study participation and data processing, and the consistency around data retention period. So how long is this data going to be held? Consent versus assent for 16 to 18-year-olds. So a 16-year-old is allowed to consent on their own behalf for inclusion in a clinical trial for investigational medicinal products, but they have to be 18 to consent for their data processing. So we have this 2-year not gap, but 2-year point where different forms are needed. So, they need to assent for their data processing between 16 until they reach 18, but they consent to participate in the study. So we would need to see, the office and the NRECs would need to see those forms for review also. Inappropriate or vague information in participant-facing material comes back to the informed part of the informed consent. It needs to be correct, and Lydia spoke really well about this yesterday, so I won't go on too much about it. And the clarity on the use of interpreters or any other accommodations that are needed, such that inclusion can be achieved as much as possible. So just to touch on clinical trial regulation. So again, as I mentioned, this came fully into effect at the end of January, and all applications now come through the clinical trial information systems. And as I mentioned, as my role of programme officer, I essentially live on this system. So this is brought in a coordinated assessment between the the HPRA and the committees to reach a single national decision. So now an application comes in 2 dossiers. So we have the part 1, which is the protocol, the IB, the IDMC charter, everything to do with the IMP, and the sort of the way the trial is going to be conducted. And that is reviewed by both the HPRA and ourselves, by the committees, and everything to do with how the trial is conducted in Ireland. So the recruitment, and I'll just go into this shortly, but everything to do with the participants, the recruitment, the sites, the PI, the insurance, everything like that is in the Part 2 dossier, which our committees solely have responsibility for and can raise considerations on. So CETUS gives you timelines for all of these. So so all of the considerations or RFI or decisions have to be uploaded within, there's a countdown on CETUS for each individual task, for each individual trial, and we must be in line with those. So once the trial comes in, we try to look at the timelines to see when it can be reviewed and how much time we have to get those that information back up on the system. So again, that's part of mine and my colleagues' roles. So we work very closely with our stakeholders here, the department and the HPRA, and we have a very good, close working relationship there. So in terms of the timeline, as I said, it came fully into effect 2 months ago. Exactly 2 months ago, and after a year's transition period where applicants could submit through the CTD, so the old way, or this new way through CETUS. So we didn't have too many CETUS applications at the start, but they certainly started to ramp up as the end of the year came. And as I said, that's the only way of applying now. So in order to get ready for CETUS, the National Office and the HPRA had launched a national collaboration project where we sort of road tested the joint approach, the timelines, and we tried to mirror the system as best we could. So I think once it actually came into effect, we were much more prepared for the realities of it. So the feedback so far is that it is a more streamlined, once we get to grips with all the timelines and how everything works, I think the feedback is good, that it is more streamlined, it's more focused so far. So it'd be interesting to see over the next year how it sort of plays out. But I think it's a good thing. So just in terms of, as I've said, I've already said that. So these are all, just in the interest of time, since I've already said these, so that these are the Part 1 document and these are the Part 2 documents that the NREC can raise considerations on. So considerations are, so many considerations makes up one request for further information. So that's what a consideration is. So what do we get in the Part 2? So recruitment arrangements. And these documents are all on EU templates. So all of the templates are the same across the EU. Now we have our own NREC templates that are based on that, but we accept the EMA endorsed templates also, apart from the site-specific assessment. That has to be the NREC one. All of that's on our website anyway, if anyone is preparing an application. But recruitment arrangements and all of that detail is given. Of course, the pills and the ICFs and assent forms and other participant-facing material, the suitability of the investigator and of the sites, proof of insurance and indemnification where appropriate, financial and other arrangements. So, do we have full funding for this trial, and what is the compensation for the participants, and we would expect to see in the pill how those participants can easily claim that money back. Collection, storage and use of biological samples, again really important, and of course data protection, the DPIA and a statement of compliance. So this is what we would get for the Part 2. So just this in terms of what is the changes for the NREC. So now rather than one full list of documents, we now get it in these 2 dossiers with separate timelines, which we in the office manage. So we have the scientific assessment and the ethical assessment. But of course, the ethics comes into the scientific assessment as well. So considerations can be raised there as well by the NREC. So to date, as of yesterday, we have 26 new applications. We've had 7 substantial modifications through the system. And we've had 17 trials that have transitioned from the old directive to the new regulation. So just to note that part 1 and part 2 don't actually need to be submitted together. So we may get a part 1, and then up to 2 years later we may get the part 2 when the trial is ready to start in Ireland. And another change is that applicants can actually appeal a decision which wasn't available under the CTD. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions during the panel.